Hello, everybody. Welcome again to Then, Now, and the Future. And we're basically this week we're transitioning into the 70s from the 60s. So I'm just going to kick off with this was my sort of, I mean, Marcus basically had all the ideas for the 70s, but there was one thing I wanted to sort of bridge which was the hippie movement and the whole connection with India. So that's my intro. But Marcus, do you want to say something to introduce the whole, and then we'll do that?
Yeah, well, I think the 60s, as we said last time, was a time of huge transition. So I think there's still a little bit that we've got to talk about the 60s, but masses of stuff during the 70s that we can just start to pick our way through. But you've had a connection with sort of India, haven't you?
Yes.
And there was this thing towards the end of the 60s with Indian gurus and
Yes.
the hippie movement. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your experience.
Right. Well, yes. So I mean, just I was just reading up a bit on this before. So you had something called beatniks already in the sort of late 50s. So people were sort of becoming interested in this kind of thing, and then over the 60s, it developed more fully. And eventually you had this thing, this route that people took, the hippie trail, that's what it was called. And people would just go across, the Middle East, through what's called, what's Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan into India, as a trail. They would start like Istanbul, that kind of area, and get there from various parts of Europe. So anyway, that was a route, and people were going along that route, and there were like hotels along the way where they were hanging out together and exchanging stories and so on. But the whole thing of it, and another thing I want to say, it's not actually something new. We had people going out to the east from Europe earlier as well, and I guess my take on this is a bit spiritual, because I myself went to India in the 80s, in the early 80s, and that can only be has to be connected with that movement to some extent, although it wasn't actually as such a hippie trip or anything like that. So I think from a sort of theological perspective, I would say there's a lot to do with a sort of something in the West of a sort of dry intellectualism, and even what Christian religion as it had become in the West had become very, let's say, syllogistic or logical, but it didn't have a sort of spiritual, mystical element. And I think that this is what drew people to the East. And it was a very colorful time, and it's still, I guess, in this, coming to the 70s, I was like in the 70s, I was beginning to be a teenager, something in the late 70s, that's when I became a teenager. And still this trappings of India were there,
Would your experience later on, sort of in the 80s, been similar to that of the 70s?
Yeah, mostly no, I would say. Not some overlap. I mean, I was in it with a yoga group called Sahaja Yoga, and the idea of this was some sort of easy yoga, that you didn't have to go into some great physical contortions or go and stand, on your head on a mountain in the Himalayas, something like that. You didn't have to do that, but you could achieve that in an easy way. So it was more like a package tour in a way. I went with lots of people doing this thing. There were Westerners, people from Europe, America, Australasia, that kind of all coming together. And then we're getting on a bus. So there were similarities, maybe, sitting on a bus and that kind of thing. So yeah, in the sense that people in those days who were going for really with the gurus and that kind of thing, there would have been overlaps, yeah. And just this sort of this mystical fascination with the whole Indian scene.
Yeah. How did that come about, do you think? This this build-up of India as the mystical place that people wanted.
Well, because I guess
and gurus and
because
the Beatles.
Yeah, that's right. Even the Beatles were involved in that, weren't they? And I think because that's what it has, you know, I mean, it is mysterious, it is mystical, the Hindu religion, you know, the idea of meditation and enlightenment. There are different ways of saying that, you know, nirvana would be the Buddhist description. And this whole idea that you can achieve this, or oneness with the absolute being, this idea of the monism, that everything is one reality and you have to realize that you're part of God, you know, that kind of thing. So you're meditating to have this extraordinary mystical experience of your oneness with the divine being. Again, you know, different traditions defining it in different ways, but it was the idea that it was more than just a concept, a belief in certain ideas, but it was an experience of the whole being.
Although it was later for you, did it have that sort of profound effect for you?
Well, yeah, I suppose there wasn't the same sense of adventure those original people had. I mean, you know, I knew I wasn't doing anything so unusual and going to India or so new, you know. But I guess, I mean, it was within the context of this yoga group that it was entirely within that context, and I felt that I was on a pilgrimage and achieving a lot with it. But I didn't actually, I mean, it was more like a good feeling, but I wouldn't say I had any profound mystical experience.
Okay, the cynical ex-journalist in me,
yes,
when you look at the 70s, would say that there were perhaps some strange substances involved in.
Yes, well, that's it. Well, certainly my yoga group was totally against that. It was very squeaky clean, as you would say. So, but yes, I mean, you know, a lot of people were going on that kind of line and having a mystical experience that way. So, but I think that's cheating, you know. I don't think that's the real thing.
That's the shortcut method.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but you know, a fascinating time and a fascinating part of the world. And do you think? I mean, are people still doing those trips?
I think there is still that. You know, obviously, you know, tourism to India has you know advanced greatly since those days, but I think still people are attracted by that. Yeah, and you know that's the similar feeling is there, that people looking for something a bit more. And people will still get involved in yoga on a spiritual, you know, so you have yoga as just a physical exercise,
yeah.
But I think generally speaking, there's some sort of meditation attached to it and so on. So I think people are on a lower key level interested in that. But it doesn't seem to be the sort of mass movement that it was back then.
Sure. So perhaps we can start edging our way into
yes.
into the 70s. You're by then into your teenage years.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was born in 65, so I was by the end of the 70s, I was a teenager. Yeah.
Sure. So what are your sort of initial sort of memories of the 70s?
Okay, well, you know, you've listed, you know, before we started today, you listed a lot of things that happened, and of course I can remember most of these. So I'm just trying to think of what would be the most striking. Decimalization. I mean, that's a big one, isn't it? Actually, you know, from pounds, shillings, and pence to, you know, tens. Everything's nice and decimalized in hundreds and tens. And that's, you know, I'm the generation which never had any practical interaction with pounds, shillings, and pence. What about you?
Oh, crumbs, yes. I mean,
yeah,
you know, by the 70s, I was born in 51. So
yeah.
by the 70s, I was into my late teens. So
yes.
my whole life up until that point had been pounds, shillings, and pence.
Yes.
And there was a big learning curve to go over to decimalization.
Yeah, but how complicated was that system compared to decimalization? You know, because as I say, I never lived with it. I'm just trying to think.
Well, it wasn't complicated because things aren't complicated when you grow up with them.
Yes.
So that's all you know.
Yeah.
Certainly a far more complicated system than decimalization.
Yes.
But then we had to start getting our heads around the fact that you know, 10p wasn't equivalent to the old 2 bob, or
right.
You know,
So did money somehow lose its value, do you think, in that period? Was it one of those things?
It didn't lose its value. Things seemed to suddenly go up in price.
Yeah, yeah.
For sure. And everyone blamed, oh, well, we have to round it up because it's decimalization. So prices were getting rounded up.
That's usually what happens, isn't it? Yeah.
As they do with
But they're not going to get rounded down, are they?
No. But it was difficult just getting your head around the fact that the new coins, although some of them were similar in size.
Yes.
So 10p and the old 2 bob.
Yes.
Didn't equate. They were
really
same size and
didn't have the same
looked
value.
the same, but they didn't have the same value.
Right. Okay.
You know, the 5p piece looked a bit like the old sixpence for
Yes. Well, so I remember that much. You know, were they interchangeable at any stage, or? I seem to remember these old coins that we were still using, but a shilling, was 5 pence. So I don't know. I mean, was that still used?
You know what? I can't really remember whether they were changeable, but it was a massive change. Everything, we were still using on-street parking meters, so all of those had to be changed.
Oh yeah. I remember you pushed the coins in.
That's right. Everything had to be changed because coins were different sizes and different thicknesses. Massive change, and younger people obviously take to it quite easily.
Yes.
For older people, it was a time of complete and utter confusion to go out and go shopping, and just trying to get your head around the different value coins and what they all meant. It was a very confusing time for a lot of people.
Well, that's it. Whenever these things change, causes confusion. And I guess that ties in with the European Union or the EEC, the Common Market. EEC.
That's right. The European Economic Community. Right. So I think it was Ted Heath who took us into that.
Yeah.
He signed the agreement, and we then ratified that yet again later in the decade. We voted to stay in, and I remember working on a local paper called the Lee Valley Mercury at Waltham Cross in Hertfordshire.
Okay.
So we were a small local paper, and I remember having to write a feature on the pros and cons of staying in the common market.
Okay. Yeah.
To try and help our readers make that decision. But back in the 70s, we voted to stay in. But it was it was at that time a trading arrangement. It wasn't, and we don't want to get into the whole political debate.
Yeah, it's another story, isn't it?
But I don't think anyone ever realised or thought they voted for, Brussels and
that's been the thing that's developed since then, really, isn't it?
So the whole thing grew into or morphed into something sort of totally different.
Yes.
But originally it was just a trading arrangement between a dozen countries.
So I mean, I personally just remember the terms, and it was something that didn't really have any great impact on me that I could identify.
And for the majority of people, I don't think it had a huge impact, other than we could get goods from abroad more easily and perhaps a bit cheaper than they otherwise would have been if you were trying to import them yourself.
Okay, what's up next then?
Where should we go? How about Concorde? Because the 70s saw the introduction of flights between London and New York, cut traveling times by a massive amount, and you had this fantastic, iconic plane. I remember I used to live in Croydon, and we were underneath the flight path for Concorde. At that point, it was still quite high up in the sky. It wasn't, but I remember on clear summer days where you had these lovely blue skies, and you'd see Concorde flying overhead.
And was it very did it disturb you, the noise?
No. You could hear it. I mean, it was like any plane.
Yeah.
You could hear it, but it was still reasonably high.
Yeah. I had a model of it. I had a sort of metal model. And actually, just harking back to last week, we were talking about the moon thing and so on. I had I made a model of the rocket, as well. Plastic.
Oh, well.
Airfix, wasn't it? Airfix, I think.
That's right, Airfix models. But yeah, one of the most beautiful aeroplanes I think that has flown. And
the amazing thing is that there's been no replacement. So that was it's eventually phased out, and that whole idea of supersonic passenger travel just has gone, and it was very extravagant, really, wasn't it? I guess
it was, and perhaps because you were limited, obviously, in the number of passengers, and it's an expensive. It was
that's it.
Kit.
The idea you should fly across the Atlantic in I don't know how long was it, 2 or 3 hours or something?
Yeah, it was about 3 hours.
It
cut the time in pretty much in half.
Yeah, that's it. So that that was somehow justified back then, but now doesn't seem to be so important.
No, but it was just the most amazing thing to see up in the sky.
Yeah. And it must have been quite an experience to arrive in America so quickly, and the sort of time, lag implications in that. I don't know how that was different from.
Well,
maybe it was easier, perhaps. I don't know.
We still weren't into the sort of modern age that we are now, where you've got what we're doing now, sort of Zoom and that sort of communication. So I think the fact that you could travel across, to the States in that sort of time frame meant that, for business people.
Sure.
That was important. But now you could just sit where we're sitting and
well, that's it. It's not so much needed.
Why would you pay thousands of pounds to travel if you could do what we're doing?
Yeah.
But at the time it was an amazing sight to see.
Yeah, sure.
Perhaps if we wander from there to the winter of discontent.
Okay.
Do you
better tell you better, because you were more aware. You tell me, and I have some sort of memories of it, but you could.
It was all based around trade and industrial disputes, and all sorts of people went on strike. Most notably, refuse collectors. And that lasted for, I can't remember exactly how long it lasted for, but it lasted for ages. And you were walking through, I was living in London, but it was across the country, mountains of rubbish that just weren't getting collected. And these piles of rubbish were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they were literally mountains. And it was one of those dark industrial sort of disputes that just went on and on. And like everything else, you just end up shrugging and learning to live with the fact that you're walking around in a dust heap.
Really, I can just remember that. But what other things was that? Was that the crisis? There was a crisis, and you couldn't. There was the working week was shortened or something. There was a big energy crisis because one of the things that happened, there was an oil shortage. And a 50-mile-an-hour limit was introduced on all roads in the country, including motorways, because there was an oil shortage. And I can't remember whether it was exactly the same time, but there was certainly the 3-day working week was introduced because there was an energy crisis. Street lights used to get switched off in the street. So all of the street lights were being turned off. I remember driving through, I think it was Finchley in North London. And the main road was absolutely black because all the street lights were off.
and
Yeah.
we stopped to have a meal in an Indian restaurant. And I mean, it was very romantic, but you're sitting there by candlelight.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's right. I remember power cuts and candles. Yeah, we had you have a box of candles
Yeah,
in the drawer somewhere, and then yeah. That's sort of coming back now.
yeah. So yeah, a strange time, strange time. And also, I mean, it's interesting, a time of huge inflation, because one of the things that I came across was the fact that between the start and the end of the
Yes.
decade,
Mhm.
the cost of living went up by nearly 200%.
Yeah, yeah. So that was the last time we're entering into this kind of level now, aren't we? We're beginning to get it back into that, but that, you know, we've had since, so that's how long ago? 70s. Like we've had 40 years or so without that kind of inflation.
Yeah. So with
And
financial stability,
yeah,
you know, but
yeah,
that we've all got used to. But yeah, that was a very difficult time. I remember as a I got married in my early 20s,
yeah,
and being absolutely horrified and scared because mortgage rates just kept jumping
yeah,
up. And you know, how are we going to pay the mortgage?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
you know, it seemed like every month there was another increase,
yeah.
and it was, you know, for a young married couple, quite scary.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this mortgage system's caused plenty of feelings like that, hasn't it, over the decades?
Yeah. But again, I remember as a young married couple, we, you know, you'd have credit cards and you'd borrow on one to pay off the other.
Yeah, yeah. I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a very scary time. I dreaded the postman coming.
Well, now that's been going back, isn't it, with the energy bills going through the roof? Yeah, so
Yeah,
it's so
yeah,
pleasant.
yeah. So what else? The Queen's Silver Jubilee. That was
Yeah, I don't know, a coin. I can remember a coin of that and a mug.
yeah.
So
Street parties. Did you have street parties?
no, probably yeah. It doesn't ring so much of a bell. Well, that was 77, wasn't it? I think street. Yeah,
Yeah,
so,
yeah. It was about 77. Yeah,
yeah. I just remember the paraphernalia. You know, the merchandise. Don't remember the sort of, but I was only 12 years old, so
right. Yeah, I remember we had a big street party
I
where
really,
one of the few times neighbours actually spoke to each other.
oh right, okay, not so communicative.
Um, Ford Cortinas. Do you remember Ford?
Of course. Now, yeah, this when you wrote this, thought, yeah, that's interesting because when you're a young teenager, you know, school kid, well, at least for me anyway, cars were a fascination, definitely. So this opens a whole memory bank. Thing called top trump cards. I don't know if you know those. These were these cards, and you had a photograph of a car, and underneath you had top speed, acceleration, fuel economy, this kind of stuff. And the game, and basically you would ask somebody, you divide the cards, and you would try and get the higher. So you say to the other person, okay, it's top speed, and if you had a faster car than him, then you would get his card.
Yeah.
So that was yeah, and that would introduce this whole. So you were aware of all the models of cars through this. And I remember the small ads in the newspaper, and I used to read these at great length. You know, how much a Mercedes, a secondhand Mercedes D-Class, whatever it was, and it was just I was really sort of obsessed with it. I can remember that.
Yeah.
So
well, the Cortina was the best-selling car.
Yeah.
Of the decade. Yeah, I remember my older brother had one, and I drove his occasionally with a huge gear stick.
Really? Yeah.
It was I know the gear stick must have been sort of that sort of size. It was absolutely massive, and you sort of these big movements, from first to second.
Right. Okay.
And of course, all cars had just 4 gears.
Yeah, we had Fiat. I remember we had a Fiat 500, the little one back in London when I was very small. And then we sort of got some bigger Fiats at various points. And at one point, my father had a Wolseley Do you know that car?
I remember the walls. Yeah, they looked quite posh, didn't they?
It was sort of, yeah, sort of semi-posh. It was like a cut above the average, I suppose. But it wasn't so practical. I think in the end, we went back to a Fiat estate car or something like that.
Yeah. And although inflation was going up, it was still a time of, I guess, some affluence, because it was the rise of the package holidays to Spain.
Yes.
So everybody was suddenly rushing off abroad. You got cheap flight. You got these package holidays which paid for your flight, paid for your hotel.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether they were what we'd call all inclusive now.
Yeah.
You probably got some of your
I should think more or less. Yeah, more or less.
Yeah, and so
and that was the beginning of the connection with Spain, wasn't it? I mean, I don't know when that really started, when the first mass flights out to Spain really got going, but it was in full swing in the 70s. Yeah, and I can remember my friends' families were going. So that we're talking now, early to mid 70s, that kind of thing. And we didn't do that. We had a sort of flight. We had sort of went to France. And it wasn't. Going to Spain wasn't quite the thing. But a lot of people did.
Benidorm and
Benidorm was the classic.
That's right. So, and some of the most iconic films that we still talk about. Have their origins back in the 70s.
Yeah, that's right, isn't it?
Yeah. Grease and Saturday Night Fever. Let's just run through a couple of the others. Star Wars, original Jaws, The Godfather, Close Encounters, and The Exorcist. Films that I mean, The Exorcist. People still talk about The Exorcist, today. But it was way back in the 70s.
Yeah, that's right. And it seems so recent, doesn't it? I always, whenever I think back of Star Wars, and it was in the 70s, I think, wow, it just didn't seem quite so long ago. But it's a bit like music in a way, isn't it? The music had this sort of the real, I don't know. I mean, I just feel that the 80s on a musical level was definitely a step down. I mean, I was just in a restaurant the other day and they were playing 80s. I thought, what, I mean, compared to the progressive rock and whatever, it just seemed to be so, crude, I think is the word. And I don't know if that's true for films. I'm not really a film buff. What was that guy on the TV? What was his name? Norman. Somebody Norman.
Yes. He did. It
wasn't Harry. Anyway. We should know this, but anyway, that was the thing. Everybody watched his film review.
Yeah, absolutely, they did. Yes, that's
Barry, wasn't it? Wasn't it Barry Norman?
Barry Norman.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And his film reviews, everybody watched that.
Yeah.
That made or.
Well, I guess, he was certainly for the British viewers. That would be decisive, I guess.
Yeah. But some iconic films there for sure. It was also the start of the digital age, I suppose. One of the things that surprised me: pocket calculators and the original digital watches.
I remember those. They've even had one actually.
The latter part of the 70s. I always remember my wife saying to me that one of her maths tutors, was talking to her or telling her off in a class about being able to add up or do some sort of math calculations, and you're not going to have something in your pocket that you can carry around and that's going to do this. But well, you know what? Yes, there was.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. What do we say? I'm just trying to think my own relation with computers. Again, 80s really. When I worked as a computer operator in the early 80s. So but I certainly remember the digital watches. I might have even had one.
So they would have been quite simple affairs.
Yeah, just a very simple thing. It was just there with the time in a. That's right, because you had LED and what was the other one? LED and LCD, wasn't it? LED was like a more of a sort of red line, very sort of crude thing. Whereas LCD was this, you know, the smoother with a silver background and the darker letters. So yeah, I mean that's a rabbit hole to go down that. But and the transistor radio. But when was the transistor radio? That was
that was the latter part of the 60s.
That was came in then. Yeah. So what were people doing in the late 70s by that time? Did they have the boombox? Did they have the sort of the thing they were carrying around? The ghetto blaster. You know,
ghetto blaster. That's something we need to look into for our next chat.
Yeah. We're getting a bit hazy on dates and stuff now, aren't we? On these
things. But Action Man.
Action Man. Okay.
Everyone's sort of favorite toy back in the, you know, it was the top selling toy back in the 70s, but people still talk about Action Man. You know, the longevity of some of these things is absolutely amazing, isn't it? Their ability to keep it running, because other toys seem to have a very short shelf life.
Yeah, like Lego. Of course, I grew up with Lego, and I was with some friends, you know, with children the other day, and they're exactly the same thing with the Lego.
Well, yeah, you know, Lego now has its own theme park, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So amazing. I'm not sure what it is that keeps some of these toys going while other toys just have, you know, they're like a shooting star.
It's something that, I mean, like it's
fizzle out.
Useful. You can do so much with it. You know, there's so much room for imagination with it, isn't there? Although now they're making these you've got a kit which is basically some monster, or I don't know what it is, you know, and there's not much imagination now. You just put together what they made, but you can still buy the basic bricks and make your own, you know, town or whatever you want.
Absolutely. So we've had a bit of a quick canter through the 70s,
flying tour of that. So yeah, maybe we'll slow down a bit from now on. I think perhaps we should start looking at smaller periods.
Sure.
So anyway, it's a sort of hopefully it's somebody's sort of mixed memories and thoughts coming in here. So
but it's just nice going back and revisiting some of these things.
Yeah, that's right. So for us, it's just sort of refreshing, bringing to life some old memory, you know, brain cells, and hopefully we can get more efficient in making it sort of relevant and interesting.
Well, I'm sure it's relevant and interesting now, but we could make it perhaps even.
But we can even improve on that.
Yeah, you could always improve.
Yeah, sure.
But Peter, pleasure as always.
Thank you. Great, Marcus. Okay, well, we'll be catching up next time.